We want to discuss chapter 5 from the text, which is the ISLM model. So far, we have separately considered equilibrium in the goods market, which we looked at in chapter 3 of the text, where we had one equilibrium condition, y is equal to z, where y is our output, z is total demand for goods. So here we had one variable, y. Then we separately looked at equilibrium in the financial market in chapter 4. We had one equilibrium condition here, money demand is equal to money supply. This was our equilibrium condition for the financial market. And here we had one variable, interest rate. So in chapter 3, we focused on output. In chapter 4, we focused on interest rate. The goal now in the ISLM model is to look at both goods market from chapter 3 and financial market from chapter 4 together, rather than each in isolation, which is what we've done so far. So far, we looked at goods market only in chapter 3 and financial market only in chapter 4. We now want to look at both of them together in order to now jointly determine equilibrium y and I in the short run. So that's the goal here. The goal in the ISLM model is to jointly determine equilibrium output and interest rate in the short run. So far in chapter 3, we looked at how do we determine equilibrium output in short run. In chapter 4, we looked at how do we determine equilibrium interest rate in short run. But now in chapter 5, the ISLM model, we want to look at how do we jointly determine equilibrium output and interest rate in the short run. So now we know aggregate demand in the goods market, as we saw in chapter 3, is expressed as Z plus I plus G if we're looking at a closed economy, net exports are zero. And here we assume that consumption was a function of disposable income, Y minus T. So C is a function of Y minus T. And we took investment, government spending, and taxes as exogenously given. I is I bar, G and T are also taken as given. And in a closed economy, net exports are zero, so we haven't written net exports here. Previously, we assumed investment was exogenous, I is equal to I bar. This is what our assumption in chapter 3 was. Now we will expand our model by assuming investment depends positively on output and negatively on interest rate, and hence now we can write our investment relation as investment is a function of y and I instead of I is equal to I bar like we previously did. So now we're expanding our model. Now before we move forward, let's go a little deeper and take a closer look at this new investment relation. So we're saying now instead of assuming investment is exogenously given, we're assuming, like we said, it depends, if we go back, we're assuming it depends positively on Y. So let's first look at why does investment depend positively on Y. Now, increases in Y will increase investment because output is an indicator of the strength of the economy. Firms invest more when they believe demand will be strong, and hence we see this positive relationship between I and Y. Now, why does investment depend upon interest rate? Where we saw there's a negative relationship. And remember, this interest rate here that we're looking at, as we discussed in chapter 4, is the interest rate on bonds. Sorry. So now there are two cases that we consider when we're looking at why investment depends upon interest rate. So we can analyze this under two cases. Number one, a firm borrows funds in order to invest. Now, the idea is that in order to finance investment, oftentimes you need to borrow money or issue bonds, and you have to pay interest on such loans at the current interest rate. So interest rate represents the cost of borrowing in such a case, and an increase in the interest rate means cost of borrowing increases, which leads to decreased investment. So one reason why investment depends upon interest rates is that oftentimes to finance investment, you need to borrow money or issue bonds. So interest rate represents the cost of borrowing money for investment, and an increase in interest rate means an increase in the cost of borrowing. Case 2 could be what if the firm has its own funds in order to finance investment projects without the need to borrow? Even in this case, investment depends negatively on interest rate. Why is that? Because even if you're using your own funds, there's an opportunity cost of doing so. The return you could have earned by simply putting the money into, say, bonds rather than investing it in by building a factory or buying an aircraft or so on. So in such a case, interest rate represents the opportunity cost of investment rather than buying bonds. So an increase in interest rate on bonds means that buying bonds becomes relatively more attractive compared to financing investment projects with the funds that you have, which leads to decreased investment. So when we talk about it, investment depends negatively on interest rate. So this is true regardless of whether you borrow money to invest or or you're using your own funds. In either case, higher interest rate means lower investment. Because if you're borrowing money to invest, then interest rate represents the cost of borrowing. And a higher interest rate means it becomes more expensive to borrow. And if you're using your own funds, interest rate represents the opportunity cost of investment rather than buying bonds. And a higher interest rate means that it's more attractive to buy bonds rather than finance investment projects with the funds that you have. So investment depends negatively on interest rate, regardless of whether you have your own funds to finance investment or you're borrowing money. Because if you have your own funds, you can think about the interest rate as opportunity cost of investment rather than buying bonds. And if you're borrowing, you can think about the interest rate as the cost of borrowing. Now, here just a couple of things to reiterate that investment here is not to be confused with buying bonds that yield interest. This is not what we mean investment in the macroeconomic context. In the macroeconomic context, investment is purchasing of new equipment by firms and purchase of new houses by households. And as we saw, these depend negatively on interest rate, regardless of whether you need to borrow money. And here we're assuming that all firms borrow at the same interest rate, which is the interest rate on bonds. In reality, for many firms borrow from banks possibly at different rate, right, depending upon riskiness and all. But here we're simplifying things. So under this new environment, what new environment? Initially in chapter 3, we assumed that investment is exogenously given, but now we're assuming investment depends positively on Y and negatively on I, and we looked at why that is the case. So now under this new environment, aggregate demand is given to us as DC plus I plus G. Now, instead of I bar, we have IY. If we go back, here we had I bar. Now, in this new environment, we're assuming investment depends upon Y and I. Instead of I bar, we have this investment relation. Now, we know the equilibrium condition for the goods market is Z is equal to Y. So, taking these two equations together, the aggregate demand equation and the equilibrium equation, the condition for equilibrium in the goods market becomes Y is equal to Z, right? And this Z is just equal to this, right? So, I'm just plugging it here. So now in this equation, we have two variables, Y and I. We can represent this equilibrium condition of the goods market in a diagram which plots Y on horizontal axis against I on vertical axis, and this gives us what is called the IS curve. So we get the IS curve by plotting our goods market equilibrium condition in a diagram with Y on horizontal axis and I on vertical axis. So essentially, what is the IS curve? The IS curve shows us all those combinations of output and interest rate for which goods market is in equilibrium. Where goods market equilibrium is given to us as Y is equal to Z. We know Z being demand is C plus I plus G plus NX. Or equivalently, for a closed economy, where net exports are zero, we already looked at in chapter 3 that for a closed economy, this goods market equilibrium condition can be rewritten as private investment is equal to national savings, which is the sum of private and public savings. Now, if we look at the goods market model and connection to the IS curve, so as we saw, the IS curve has in its background the goods market model from chapter 3. But now investment depends negatively on interest rate and positively on Y instead of investment being exogenously given. Over here, previously in chapter 3, we assumed that investment was exogenously given, I is equal to I bar in our goods market model. But now we said we want to expand our model and we take investment to depend positively on Y and negatively on I. So the key thing to remember is that the IS curve has in its background our goods market model from chapter 3, but now instead of taking investment as exogenously given, I is equal to I bar, investment depends upon interest rate. And let's just finally look at where does IS label comes from. So it comes from the fact that in a closed economy, but not necessarily in an open economy, the goods market equilibrium condition Y is equal to Z is equivalent to the condition investment is equal to national savings, hence the IS label. Because in a goods market equilibrium, because in a closed economy, the goods market equilibrium condition Y is equal to Z can be rewritten as investment is equal to savings, right? So this is only true for a closed economy. That Y is equal to Z is equivalent to I is equal to S. In an open economy, you also count for net exports. More on that later.